All right, so today we will be talking about McGeough Chapter 4, Visual Rhetoric. So, rhetoric is persuasive speech or writing or communication. And there are some unique ways in which visual communication can impart rhetoric. It has kind of a negative connotation, the word rhetoric does, but is really a neutral term, as we'll see. So first off, for visual rhetoric, the images that we consume in our daily lives, they deeply influence our perception of who we are, what our community is, what our country is, what's happening in our world, and how we respond to the events that are taking place on an international, national, and local and household scale. Viewing images enables us to understand the world in ways that we can't if we only read, and vice versa, right? There's things that we can understand differently by reading that we would not be able to wholly understand if we only viewed visual communication, right? So visual communication brings a unique way of rhetorical communication. How different groups understand images influences what parts of the past they believe are worth remembering. Okay, the things that we choose to make part of our visual lives, it says who we believe we are, who we believe the world around us is, and what we believe the world around us should be. The first piece of visual rhetoric that we're going to talk about is iconic images. And iconic images are images that just over the course of your life as being part of a culture, you come to recognize. You might not always know the exact context, you might not know what they specifically depict, but you know because of the ways that they've been shown, about how frequently they are shown, the events that they are typically shown within the context of, you have a feeling that they are important, okay? Certain images become the dominant image by which we visualize a particular event. And I have a feeling that there are a number of images where if I just describe them, you might not specifically remember all of them, but you likely have in some part of your life seen them before, and you can kind of picture them. For instance, very famous image of black students integrating public schools in Arkansas. The students walking in, and the mass of white students and adults and law enforcement surrounding them, some of them yelling at them. You have likely seen that, and you're probably saying, oh yeah, I kind of remember I seeing something like that in the past. Another one of a very passionate protest on City Hall Mall in Boston, of a black man being held by two people and another man either stabbing at him with the American flag, or depending on the background story, yanking the flag away from him. Again, you might not know the exact background of that image, but I have a feeling you're probably saying, oh yeah, I've seen that image before. The flag over Iwo Jima that you see on your screen is most likely one of those images where, even if it was not on your screen right now, if I were to say, you know, that famous black and white image of soldiers lifting a flag on a hill, you would say, oh yeah, I know that. You might not know it's the Iwo Jima flag, but it has become iconic in the history of U.S. military triumphs. So these iconic images are widely recognized and remembered as a representation of a historically significant event, and they activate a strong identification response. If you are an American, you likely have a strong response to the flag being raised over Iwo Jima. They are also reproduced this initially appeared in a newspaper, but it's since been printed, placed on, walls of government offices, private, households, all sorts of things. It has a great meaning. The flag being raised over Iwo Jima is an iconic image of World War II, but it actually has a fascinating story about how this image came to be. And we'll touch a little bit on that. I'm not going to tell the entire backstory because this is not like a history class per se. There is a great movie by Clint Eastwood called Flags of Our Fathers that tells a lot of the backstory of this event and the people who took part in it. So I do encourage you, taking that out from your local library or renting it on Amazon or whatever it might be. But the flag over Iwo Jima is undoubtedly one of the iconic images in U.S. history. So now look at another iconic image, which is decades after the flag over Iwo Jima, and this was taken from Ground Zero in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. So looking at this image, which is now obviously in color, what sort of messages do the shapes, do the color, do the principles of the Gestalt, its composition, etc., what do those all convey? Kind of look at this for a moment. Just consider it. Now think of it in terms of the Iwo Jima image from the previous slide. And I have a feeling if you think about it, there's a number of similarities, right? Oh, I moved the wrong. I wanted to move my head out of the way. Okay. So let's just go through a few, right? We have multiple people here, just like on the Iwo Jima image. You have multiple people all in similar uniforms because they're working similar jobs. In this case, they're firefighters working together to raise an American flag. And the American flag is central in the frame. And the people working it are towards the bottom of the frame. You have this diagonal line of the flagpole, or in this case, looks like it might be part of part of the building's structure that's being used as a flagpole. That, if we remember from previous lessons, that diagonal lines indicate shift, movement, right? In addition, you've got sort of this rubble in the background. They're standing on top of what looks like some sort of platform, similar to how the Iwo Jima image looked to be in kind of like the aftermath of a war battle on top of a hill. And so think about, why do you think that these two iconic images have so many characteristics in common? And there's likely a few different things at play here, right? One is there's a lot of just ingrained elements of visual communication that are consistent, right? Of, showing a number of people kind of working together to raise a flag, which is a symbol. I've talked about the diagonal line, showing them, they're dirty, they've obviously been through a lot, with the rubble in the background. This sort of thing in a vacuum would still be an impactful image. But there's also the element of, because that Iwo Jima image is so iconic, there is likely something existing in our subconscious as Americans who have seen that Iwo Jima image, have prescribed meaning to it in our own minds over our lives, that when this image from Ground Zero was taken, it stirred kind of a similar sort of visual or cultural nostalgia in us, which that's not uncommon for iconic images to kind of echo each other in a way. So related, or often a subset of iconic images, is image events. So iconic images are they can be staged, they can be portraits, they can be totally off the cuff and just taken in the heat of a moment, anything like that. And they can become iconic images. An image event is something that is specifically staged to design, to create a certain message that you want to go viral, so to speak. Although a lot of these images, most of these images, predate the concept of going viral on the internet. But it's a staged event. It's something where someone with a message to send specifically sets up a time or a situation where they say, I know that there's going to be cameras or whatever it might be, and I want to be captured doing this thing. By creating those image events, the people who are trying to send a message, they're able to manufacture a message that continues to circulate and go to broad audiences well after the event itself has ended. One instance here you see on the screen is this Greenpeace whaling ship photo. Some people from the organization Greenpeace, which is an environmental protection charity, they took this little inflatable boat out, and they were going to block some whaling ships, take a picture to kind of show, you know, their small effort on their little dinghy to impede, you know, what they believed was immoral, illegal whaling. Some images ensued. They were actually very surprised when the whaling ships just continued to bear down on them. They didn't slow down at all. At one point, you know, they shot a harpoon, I believe, that came extremely close to the boat. So the, you know, Greenpeace activists came really close to being injured or worse. But it ended up sending kind of that message visually, that just saying, hey, we took a little boat into the sea and we were in the whaling ship's way, would not really if you were just telling people about it. Many iconic images are the result of image events. Okay, so just the fact that it's staged does not make it fake. I want to be very clear about that. A staged image event does not make the message they're trying to send any less relevant or any less real. The iconic Iwo Jima photo was an image event. It is not the original raising of that flag after the Battle of Iwo Jima. Essentially, a smaller flag was put up by just a couple people, and when they saw it, they were like, that's not nearly impressive enough. So they got a much bigger flag. They went to a taller point on the hill, got more dudes together, made sure the photographer was in the right spot to take the photo as the flag was being raised. So, you know, they made sure that Iwo Jima photo would send the message that the military wanted to send to the folks back home in the U.S. Another image event that became an iconic image was Tank Man from Tiananmen Square in China. There was a military parade, essentially, in communist China, and this unidentified man, went out and he stood in front of all the tanks rolling down the street. And in all likelihood, this was an image event. This man, whether it was premeditated far in advance or just he was inspired by something that morning to walk out in front of the tanks, we'll never know. But he obviously knew that there would be cameras there, and he knew that it would send a strong message if he went out and he had his picture taken in front of these tanks. Reason we'll never know is that, you know, after the tank stopped and the man was taken into custody, he has never really been heard from again. China claims he's living a quiet retirement somewhere in the countryside. Others believe that his fate was not so wholesome. But this was an image event that became an iconic image, like many of them are. So another form of visual rhetoric is monuments or public memory. But monuments, we think of those as, the statues, the plaques, those sorts of things that are set up in certain locations that, we deem important, or that historical events happened, those sorts of things. And these monuments or these memorials, they're visual representations of a past that the people in that culture want to remember, and they want to emulate, and they want to embrace. How that past is visually represented at these memorial sites plays a really important role in how we remember it. So one very famous monument you have here on your screen is the Statue of Liberty, right? The Statue of Liberty is an often photographed monument in the harbor in New York. It was a gift from France, and it is a symbol of America's embrace of the tired, the poor, the immigrants who came to this country, fleeing inequality, war, all those sorts of things, to seek a better life. So the fact that the Statue of Liberty is placed so prominently and is so celebrated says something about how the United States of America wants to remember itself, or wants to depict itself on the world stage. Monuments are not always without controversy, and you may have obviously seen this, in recent years. There's been a lot of fights over depictions, in the South of, Confederate generals, statues to people like Christopher Columbus, who the reality of their achievements, so to speak, are not necessarily, we're coming to a greater understanding that there are not really as achievements as we maybe tend to think of them. But those things also happen in a more modern light as well. Because no monument can objectively represent the past. Just like in every snapshot you take a decision about what is central to the frame, what colors you use, what angles you use. If you're putting together a monument or a memorial, you're choosing what you want to remember about that event. And what we choose to remember about that past and whose version of history gets carved into that stone makes monuments inherently political. They're a documentary, so to speak. A documentary is not unbiased. It's not objective. The person who made that documentary is, yes, they're talking about history, but they're choosing what pieces of history, what voices to include. The monuments are doing exactly the same thing. They're choosing which people to include, which people to put up front, all that. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. is a great example of that. When it began to be constructed in the early 80s, and finally in 1982, when it was actually constructed, it was a very controversial memorial. The idea to make it a continuous wall with the names of all the soldiers who lost their lives in that war was initially very controversial among people who felt, looking at the World War I, World War II, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, all those sorts of things that they said, well, those monuments are celebratory, right? They're showing the glory of those individuals or those events or whatever it might be, and you shouldn't make a Vietnam memorial that highlights the loss of life in that conflict, right? That was one of the views. In addition, the designer of it, Mai Lin, was Asian. It was obviously Vietnam was an Asian war fought against an Asian enemy. Also fought ostensibly in defense of an Asian people, but there was still folks who felt that it was disrespectful that the designer of that memorial was an Asian woman. And so there was a lot of sort of fighting over whether this would be the version that eventually was used. And there was a lot of ways in which that showed up. So over time, the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. came to be complemented by a number of other more traditional statues nearby. So the first was the Three Soldiers statue, in which it shows these three American soldiers, kind of shown. They're hardly shown in the triumphant ways that say a lot of World War II soldier statues are shown. There's one with kind of his shirt sleeves, no undershirt. The other one has like a something around his neck, so it's made to look that like they're sweaty, that they've been walking in the jungle for a long time. They're kind of looking far away. You notice that they don't have their rifles raised. So it's actually kind of a good depiction, in my opinion, in a way of like how much of war, but especially the Vietnam War, was just kind of like hanging around and walking places and just like a drag. So it's kind of funny in a way that the statue that was added to supposedly add a more personal touch to a monument that was supposedly too much of a downer has kind of just like it perfectly couples with that, of showing, one shows all the folks who gave their lives, and the other shows, even the ones who may have survived, in this case, still it didn't have a great time. You'll notice, though, that the three soldiers are all male. So beyond that, later the Vietnam Women's Memorial was also added in a similar place near the Vietnam War Memorial, and this one shows the importance of nurses, technicians, all sorts of roles that women held in that war, and why it was important. That being said, though, as I said, every monument includes decisions made by its creators. You also have to look here and say, okay, each of these represents, certain, race, certain age of soldier or woman. There's still obviously decisions that are being made with the people that are depicted in these statues. So monuments, public memory, they're always intensely political, regardless of whether they're intended to be a controversial political statement or not. All right, now we're going to talk about propaganda. And I do want to be clear, a lot of this imagery that we have to use when we're talking about political rhetoric, communications rhetoric, it can be troubling. So I don't share any of this image to endorse it at all, but we do need to study it in order to understand it. And propaganda is the use of art, any sort of art, to create an emotional response in audience members and lead them to a particular political identification. Okay, so that's kind of the key of the propaganda piece, because everything we've talked about so far is the use of art to create an emotional response, right? Even if that emotional response is remembrance, or mourning or inspiration or anything like that, propaganda is trying to lead you towards a particular political viewpoint, values, what have you. Films especially can be really effective forms of propaganda, but it can also just be used through a single image. The most effective propaganda is not just one thing. It is an entire collection of media that is used intensely, to surround a person, billboards in their daily lives, programs on TV, commercials, advertisements, stickers, patches, all kinds of stuff. Radio announce. Well, that's not visual, but any sort of communication that largely almost forces a populace into a certain mindset. So if you look at this image here I'm assuming everyone recognizes the Nazi swastika, but what other elements, if you look at this picture, do you recognize from perhaps more familiar and supposedly friendly forms of imagery? So first we have the eagle, right? I mean, the eagle is popular among a lot of countries, including the United States, as a symbol of strength. You also have the wreath. The wreath is a very popular symbol for unity. And then obviously the swastika is a pretty unique political image. It does have some other connotations in the Far East and those sort of religions, but as far as in the Western world, the swastika stands alone. But the eagle and the wreath combined with the swastika can kind of condition a person into feeling a certain way about this image in front of you. Propaganda films are especially effective because they can follow that same dramatic structure of a movie or a TV show, where you have, you establish your hero, you establish the threat, you establish the problem, you build up the enemy, you build up the threat to be dealt with, and then you show the hero overcoming it. And by setting up that narrative, you establish the hero as a sympathetic figure with the audience and the threat as the enemy. Propaganda, to be clear, is something that all sides of the political spectrum engage in. Okay, so all ideologies engage with it, even the ones you agree with. Okay, you may not call it propaganda if it is an image or if it is a value system, a political ideology that you associate with, but you absolutely are someone who has probably spread propaganda. And despite its negative connotations, it's a common part of all of our lives. As I've said multiple times before, you yourself, me, we are all susceptible to propaganda. And it's important to understand the ways in which you and all of us and we are susceptible to that propaganda so that we can know how to resist it or not be brainwashed by it. If you think just inherently, no, I don't fall for propaganda, and I don't need to really think about it, I don't need to be on the lookout for it, then you have either already been influenced or you're going to be an easy mark down the line. So we have a couple of instances of things that are in our daily lives that are propaganda. Like, again, I'm not trying to say either of them are good or bad, but they are instances of propaganda. The Make America Great Again hat is a very common, affordable element of propaganda. On the other side, we have this poster from Barack Obama's inauguration. I have a feeling that, you could probably see some echoes of some past propaganda posters or imagery that you've seen from history in this Barack Obama poster. And both of these are trying to promote a political ideology. And when you look at one image or the other, depending on your political affiliation, you may recoil from one and sort of embrace the other one just because of, but the attempt is to make you feel very strongly and hopefully in whatever organization is doing it, to make you associate with that political position. So I know I keep saying this, but a lot of times we want to establish whether something is good or bad. right? You want to say, okay, this picture shows something that's bad, or it signifies something that is bad, and this one shows something, an event that is good, or it signifies something that is good. That's sort of black and white. That's really not the way the world works, and as a result, it's not really the way that visual communication works. And a lot of times, our perception of this iconic imagery clashes with the context or the reality in which it was created versus when it was consumed. You were supposed to have read a couple articles about the Times Square kiss, and this is an example of one of those iconic images. I'm sure you've seen this image before, or recreations of it or something, even if you didn't know the exact background of it, that it came from VJ Day after World War II, that it illustrates this sailor kissing a nurse. In a vacuum, it shows this great exultatory moment. The war has been won. A sailor just home. So he's obviously made sacrifices for the war effort, kissing a nurse who she has obviously contributed to the war effort by being a nurse. The assumption, perhaps they're lovers. Perhaps they're being reunited. So it's a very celebratory sort of moment. The actual story around it, these people actually didn't know each other at all. This sailor, the groups of sailors and soldiers who were returning, walking down the street, and he was apparently kissing everything in sight. And it just happened to be, this woman was kissed in the most photogenic, passionate way at this location with a photographer around, that it became an iconic image, okay? And so there was various outcry during the Me Too movement about celebrating this non-consensual kiss. The woman's grandchildren came out and had different opinions. There was also other interviews with the woman herself who spoke about it, and ultimately it led to this image being taken down, but then almost immediately like being put back up. And now it's one that continues to make the round. Some people have problems with it, but it seems like everyone involved with it, the official position of the armed forces, is that it is a iconic image that is still recreated, posted, published to this day. So when you're analyzing these iconic images, these image events, these monuments, memorials, propaganda, it's seldom as simple as right or wrong. All right. Usually it is complicated. And this Times Square kiss is an excellent example of the complicated history and background of visual rhetoric, that it is not always, well, this was a bad moment or this was a good moment. It's just something that was, and it happened, and we have to figure out a way to remember the important things in our history in ways that perhaps allow us to separate the moral or ethical right or wrong from it.